Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we aim to cut through the noise, get past the headlines, and really give you that comprehensive, actionable knowledge you need on complex topics.
Glad to be here.
And today, well, we're tackling something pretty significant. It's both philosophical, I think, but also intensely practical. We're doing a deep dive into general world theory, GWT. It's a framework, really, designed to help us make sense of, well, let's face it, a pretty fractured and volatile world right now.
Yeah, it really feels necessary, doesn't it? I mean, you just look around the planet today. Climate disruption is not just happening, it's accelerating. We have profound geopolitical instability, resource scarcity hitting community, especially regional ones, really hard.
Right.
And the systems we've relied on, they're not coping. Our traditional models of governance, economics, how we even think about development, they feel outdated. They're failing to keep up with these challenges that are all tangled up together and, frankly, getting worse.
Exactly. So our mission today, let's be clear. We're using this GWT framework, specifically its 9 core dimensions, almost like a diagnostic tool.
A lens.
A lens, yeah. We need to explore how all these different systems, social, economic, ecological, how they're really connected, why those older models tend to break down under the pressure we're seeing now, and crucially, how we can actually, practically, design for something the theory calls geopolitical resilience. Real resilience.
Okay, before we jump into the dimensions themselves, maybe we should level set for everyone listening. Just nail down a couple of key terms we'll be using a lot, because GWT uses them quite precisely.
Good idea. Lay the groundwork.
First, geopolitics. Now, this isn't just about, maps and military strategy in the old sense. It's deeper. It's about how the fundamental reality of geography, where things are plus power dynamics, plus the distribution of resources, how all that shapes global relationships, conflicts.
And how that ultimately impacts everything, right down to the local community level.
Exactly. It sets the stage, the operational environment for every single community. And second, resilience.
Ah, yes, the buzzword.
Right, it's everywhere. Sometimes it feels like it means nothing. But GWT is very specific here. Resilience isn't just sort of bouncing back after a shock. It's the capacity of a community to absorb shocks, political, economic, environmental, whatever, and critically, to adapt without losing its core functions.
Okay, so not just surviving, but adapting while retaining identity and purpose.
Precisely. And that leads to geopolitically resilient. A community like that can maintain its autonomy, its stability, its way of being, even when the global systems around it are buckling under pressure, resource conflicts, trade wars breaking out, major climate disasters.
That's a high bar.
It is, which brings us to the core idea, the central posit of GWT itself. It's a bit dense, but it's worth stating. The theory says, the world is a dynamic, relational, and plural reality.
Okay, dynamic, relational, plural.
In which all forms of being, what exists, knowing how we understand it and becoming how it changes, are entangled, contextual, and ethically consequential.
Entangled, contextual, ethically consequential.
Yeah. And because of that, it demands understanding that is transdisciplinary, crosses boundaries, situated, rooted in place, and constantly evolving. No final answers.
So fundamentally, GWT is throwing out the idea of a single fixed reality that we can just manage with some, neat technocratic plan.
Yeah, it's saying everything's connected, it's always changing, and ethics aren't an add-on, they're baked into the fabric of reality itself.
And we're going to explore this complexity through these 9 dimensions you mentioned, which I understand are grouped into 3 categories.
That's right. It helps structure the thinking. The first group looks at the very nature of reality being, knowing, and becoming. The second explores how we know the world and how systems connect. That's knowing and context. And the third group deals with how we act within this complex world, action, evolution, and ethics.
And we'll use case studies throughout, from the Amazon to the Arctic, I hear.
Yeah, real-world examples to make it tangible, from indigenous governance to post-Cold War peace efforts, Silicon Valley, all sorts.
Okay, fantastic. Let's dive in then. Let's start with those dimensions that define the nature of reality itself. Interdependence, pluralism, and becoming. All right, first up, interdependence. My understanding is this is about recognizing that all systems, ecological, social, economic, they don't just exist side by side. They actually co-evolve through constant interaction.
Exactly. Co-evolution is the key word. And this dynamic interaction, it creates both things. Vulnerabilities, like when we become overly dependent on, say, global supply chains.
Which we saw very clearly recently.
Absolutely. But it also creates incredible opportunities for adaptation, for mutual support, for resilience if we design for it.
So what's the core design principle that comes out of acknowledging this deep interdependence? How does it change how we build things, plan things?
Well, the core idea is that real geopolitical resilience doesn't come from isolating yourself. It comes from intentionally strengthening the deep links between social, ecological, economic, technological, and governance systems, especially at the local and regional level.
So stop thinking in silos.
Yeah.
Like, this is the economic plan, this is the environmental plan.
Right. They're not separate policy buckets. Think of them as interconnected metabolic flows. If your local economy, for instance, is totally geared towards extracting one resource to sell far away, you are incredibly vulnerable to market swings, political shifts elsewhere.
Makes sense.
But if you build more localized, maybe circular economic systems, think closed-loop food production, local renewable energy grids, you inherently cut down that dangerous dependence on volatile global forces. You build resilience through connection, not isolation.
It's about understanding and maybe optimizing those feedback loops within the system. We definitely saw the downside during the pandemic, didn't we? Those hyper-optimized, just-in-time global logistics. They were efficient, but brittle. They just snapped.
They snapped completely, paralyzed whole economies. It was a brutal lesson in the vulnerability created by a certain kind of interdependence, one optimized purely for cost, not resilience.
So what's a good example of interdependence working differently, maybe more resiliently on a regional scale? You mentioned the Amazon.
The Amazon basin is a fantastic, if complex, case study. GWT wouldn't frame it just as a rainforest. It's described as a living web of co-arising systems.
Co-arising systems. Explain that a bit.
Think about it. The water cycle, the hydrology, the regional climate patterns, the incredible biodiversity, and the human cultures that have lived there for millennia. They are all fundamentally emerging together, shaping each other. The health of the Amazon's water cycle, for example, literally helps generate rainfall across huge swaths of South America, affecting agriculture thousands of miles away.
It's a continental climate engine, basically. It doesn't care about national borders.
Not at all. So if you look at indigenous stewardship in the Amazon through this lens of interdependence, what do you see?
Well, I imagine it's not governance imposed on the forest, but something that grew out of it.
Exactly. It reveals this profound self-organizing system. Indigenous governance isn't separate. It's deeply intertwined with the ecological rhythms, the cycles of the forest.
Yeah.
In a very real sense, they are actively co-producing planetary health through their practices.
Wow.
And when that system gets disrupted, say, by illegal logging or large-scale industrial agriculture pushing in, it's not just a local problem. Because of that deep interdependence, it triggers a systemic unraveling with global climate consequences.
Which demands a different kind of response, presumably.
It demands what GWT calls ethical relationality, a fundamental respect for other beings, other systems, and it points towards shared governance models, models that can actually acknowledge and work with this complexity, especially in a crisis.
So the design insights here aren't about finding the single most efficient infrastructure plan imposed from outside. It's more about
It's about fostering those localized economic systems we talked about. It's about implementing adaptive feedback loops, ways for the system to sense changes and inform decisions continuously. Supporting decentralized technologies, maybe, that empower communities rather than centralizing control. And absolutely prioritizing participatory governance structures that can ethically manage these dynamic, interconnected flows.
it reframes the whole region. Not as a resource to be extracted, but as something continuously co-created by local life, global pressures, and planetary systems.
And if your design ignores those deep interdependencies, those ecological realities, it's destined to fail no matter how much money you pour into it. Hashtag tag 1.2. Pluralism.
Okay, that leads naturally into the second dimension. Pluralism. This one feels like a direct challenge to top-down thinking. It's about the necessity, GWT argues, of integrating multiple worldviews, multiple knowledge systems, rejecting the idea that there's one single right way, usually a technocratic, purely scientific, or purely economic one.
Precisely. This is absolutely critical for ethical design and for effectiveness, frankly. The core principle here is that sustainability isn't just a technical problem to be solved. It's fundamentally a cultural, ethical, and political undertaking.
So it requires bringing different voices, different perspectives to the table.
Yes. Pluralism demands we value and integrate diverse knowledge. Indigenous ways of knowing, yes, but also insights from modern science, from systems thinking, from transnational perspectives. Specifically, indigenous approaches often bring something crucial that's missing from dominant models, a focus on relational ethic, deep spiritual connections to place, and a sense of intergenerational responsibility.
Which contrasts sharply with the short-term, often extractive models driving a lot of global policy.
Hugely. It offers real alternatives. It moves us beyond thinking the only valid knowledge comes out of a university lab or a government agency.
The source material mentions the Gulf of Mexico naming controversy. It sounds symbolic, but how does it illustrate the failure of pluralism?
Well, it shows what happens when you rely on just one official narrative in this case. A name imposed by dominant powers while ignoring the deeply rooted cultural and historical perspectives of the people who actually live there and have their own names and stories tied to that place.
It alienates people.
Exactly. It immediately undermines social resilience because people feel unseen, their history dismissed. That breeds resistance, making any kind of collaborative effort, like building resilience together, basically impossible. It highlights the risk of designing from a single worldview.
Okay, let's scale that up. A massive regional example, the Sahel region in Africa. That's got to be a complex tapestry of worldviews.
The Sahel is practically the definition of a plural reality. Think of the layers. Indigenous pastoralist traditions, nomadic trading cultures, deep Islamic heritage, Christian communities, various tribal structures, and then overlaid on all of that, the legacies of colonialism and post-colonial nation building.
Wow, so governance there must constantly navigate completely different ways of seeing the world.
Absolutely. How do you reconcile, say, the drive for technocratic efficiency that might come with international aid projects with the deeply held spiritual or ancestral relationships to land that local communities have? How do you manage resources when different groups have entirely different yet valid claims and logics?
And those colonial borders often just ignored all that complexity, didn't they?
Yeah.
Cutting right across traditional territories or migration routes.
Precisely. They often slice through traditional cultural geographies and long-established resource management systems, creating conflict and often environmental damage because they disregarded existing place-based knowledge systems.
So what's the GWT takeaway for designing regional strategies in a place like the Sahel?
That any strategy for sustainable regionalization must be culturally situated. It has to be co-authored, co-created with the people on the ground, acknowledging their diverse and sometimes competing but legitimate worldviews. Pluralism asks us to see these tensions, these different land claims or governance styles, not just as problems to be solved or erased, but potentially as sources of innovation, of hybrid knowledge, of adaptive solutions.
It's about building systems that can hold difference, maybe even thrive on it, while still finding common purpose.
Yes. So the design insights that emerge focus on promoting relational ethics, how we treat each other across these differences. Ensuring cultural legitimacy is a core design criterion, not an afterthought. Using participatory planning tools that genuinely empower local voices, and developing shared governance frameworks that don't try to impose uniformity but actively integrate these competing cosmologies.
It's really a call for profound humility in the design process, isn't it?
It absolutely is, acknowledging that the experts don't have all the answers. Hashtag 1.3, becoming.
That humility seems essential for the third dimension, becoming. This sounds quite philosophical, the idea that the world isn't fixed or finished. It's constantly in flux, always transforming, being shaped by history, by crisis, by our imagination, even by acts of resistance.
It is philosophical, but with very practical consequences. The core principle of becoming directly challenges how we usually think about sustainability. We often frame it as achieving a fixed goal, like reaching net zero emissions by a certain date.
Right, a target endpoint.
GWT says no, that's misguided. If reality itself is constantly unfolding, constantly becoming, then sustainability can't be a fixed state. It has to be understood as a continuous, often contested, unfolding process. Our designs, therefore, need to be fluid, adaptive, ready for change.
And this involves confronting what the theory calls the politics of becoming. What does that mean?
It means acknowledging that people and communities carry histories, often histories of structural violence, oppression, or marginalization. Design can't just focus on managing the present crisis. It has to address those legacies and actively support the transformative futures that people envision for themselves. It's about enabling genuine transformation, not just patching up the status quo.
The source mentions the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, albeit briefly, in this context. How does that illustrate the point?
Well, the point made is that in situations like Gaza, if sustainable development efforts don't confront the deep structural violence, the imposed constraints, the geopolitical realities, if they don't support a pathway towards fundamental transformation beyond just managing the immediate crisis, then those efforts become, quote, a hollow framework.
Meaning they're doomed to fail.
Guaranteed to collapse the next time a major crisis hits because the underlying conditions haven't changed. So becoming insists that transformation, not just maintenance or relief, has to be the ultimate aim.
Okay, let's shift to a regional example of constant, maybe even disruptive, becoming. Silicon Valley seems like a prime candidate.
Oh, absolutely. Silicon Valley is the epitome of becoming in action. Think about its history. Orchards, then defense research, then semiconductors, then personal computers, software, the internet, social media, AI. It's been in perpetual revolution.
One wave of transformation layering on to the next.
Exactly. Funded by huge amounts of venture capital, driven by a specific cultural appetite for disruption, it's constantly reinventing itself.
But coming here has a dark side too, right? The source points out a paradox.
Yes, a huge paradox. This relentless transformation generates incredible global innovation. Things like fusion energy research, AI being used for recycling, personalized medicine, amazing stuff. But it simultaneously creates massive local instability.
Like the housing crisis.
Extreme housing crises, yes. Rapid gentrification pushing people out, shocking levels of economic inequality right alongside unbelievable wealth. Silicon Valley is both the engine of global transformation and a place deeply stressed and constrained by its own transformative processes, its own sort of socio-institutional inertia.
So what's the lesson from Silicon Valley about governing a system that's constantly becoming?
The lesson is profound. You can't govern a system moving at that velocity with that level of constant change using static, old-fashioned bureaucratic structures. It demands what the source calls evolutionary governance.
Evolutionary governance meaning?
Institutions and processes that can learn, unlearn, and adapt really quickly in response to feedback from the system itself. Governance that is itself designed to evolve, to be re-engineered continuously, not set in stone. It needs to be as dynamic as the system it's trying to guide.
Okay, so designing for becoming means intentionally building in flexibility. It means using imagination, maybe storytelling, to explore transformative futures, not just predictable ones. It means understanding the history that led to now, and seeing things like resistance or social movements not as problems to be suppressed, but as vital signs as part of the ongoing process of renewal and change.
Precisely. If you try to clamp down and stop the process of becoming, you might actually be killing the very source of the system's long-term resilience and adaptability.
That's a powerful thought. Okay, so if reality is this dynamic, interdependent, plural thing that's always becoming, the next obvious question is, how on earth do we know anything reliable about it? How do we connect all these constantly moving parts in our understanding?
An excellent pivot. That takes us squarely into the next set of dimensions, which focus on epistemology, how we know, and how systems are connected. We'll look at relational knowing, entanglement, and contextuality.
All right, relational knowing. This sounds like it challenges the idea of purely objective, detached knowledge. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Relational knowing asserts that knowledge isn't just abstract data floating out there. It's actually co-created. It emerges through things like interpersonal trust, shared responsibility, community values.
So who knows something, and the relationship between the knower and the known actually matters?
It matters fundamentally. This demands solutions that aren't just technically sound, but are deeply rooted locally, culturally embedded.
What's the core principle for resilience here?
The core principle is that resilience, at its heart, is a social and cultural achievement. It grows out of the quality of relationships within a community, the levels of trust, the sense of shared responsibility. Policies that are cooked up by experts in isolation, maybe in a distant capital city, often fail precisely because they lack this cultural embedding. They don't resonate, people don't trust them, they don't feel ownership.
So if you want governance that's more decentralized, more adaptive, it needs that foundation of trust and mutual understanding already in place.
It absolutely depends on it. You can't just decree decentralization. You have to cultivate the relationships that make it possible.
The source mentions a U.S. organic farming dilemma. What's the insight there regarding relational knowing?
Well, the details are sparse, but the principle it illustrates is the value of participatory design. When you bring scientists, policymakers, and farmers together to learn from each other, to share knowledge respectfully, you generate solutions that are not only scientifically informed, but also culturally rooted, respecting local practices and experiences.
People are more invested because they were part of creating the knowledge.
Exactly. Their knowledge was valued. Now, for a large-scale regional example of relational knowing really working, the source points to the Nordic countries.
Often held up as models. Why, specifically for relational knowing?
They exemplify it through their governance traditions. Think about the Nordic Council. It operates largely through consensus building, through negotiated agreements. It's relational policymaking institutionalized.
And that's possible because of shared history and values.
That's a huge part of it. Shared history, strong cultural values, even linguistic similarities foster a regional identity. But importantly, it's an identity that balances unity with diversity. They respect differences. Look at the autonomy granted to the Åland Islands, for instance, with its own distinct governance within Finland.
So when we see the Nordic countries consistently ranking at the top for sustainability, like Finland, Sweden, Denmark, in the 2024 SDG Index, it's not just about having good technical policies.
That's the crucial point GWT makes. The technical expertise, the smart policies, they gain legitimacy and effectiveness because they are embedded within these strong social relationships, within inclusive governance frameworks built on generations of trust and negotiation. It's not just top-down expertise, it's socially embedded expertise.
Will you give an example of that embedding?
Sure. Think about how some Nordic countries integrate indigenous Sami knowledge into resource management, particularly in the Arctic regions. That's a direct application of relational knowing, relational ethics. It's not just scientifically optimal. It respects Sami rights and integrates deep, long-term ecological knowledge that a purely technocratic approach might completely miss. It actually enhances the sustainability transition.
So the Nordic model really shows that resilience is rooted in that ethical relationship between people, culture, and place, actively maintained across different scales.
Yes, from the local community right up to the regional cooperation level. It's a system built on trust.
The design insights here seem clear then. Prioritize participatory design, actively honor cultural continuity in policies and projects, and focus on strengthening those relational ties between people and their specific environment. Hashtag tag 2.2, entanglement.
Okay, moving on to entanglement. This dimension takes the interconnectedness idea from interdependence and relational knowing a step further. It says that all dimensions of reality, the material, the mental, the symbolic, the political, are not just connected, they are inseparable. They co-constitute each other.
Well, okay, break that down. Material, mental, symbolic, political, inseparable.
Yeah. So if relational knowing tells us how we know things through relationships, entanglement tells us that what we know is inherently a bundle of these different dimensions. You can't neatly separate them.
So systems thinking needs to be truly holistic, integrating things we normally keep separate.
That's the core principle. It argues that building sustainable regions, for example, requires simultaneously integrating, let's say, 4 key things. 1, material infrastructures, the tangible stuff. Energy grids, roads, water systems. 2, mental paradigms or collective worldviews, assumptions, beliefs about how the world works. 3, symbolic valuations or shared sense of justice, identity, trust, what we value beyond money. And 4, political feasibility, what's actually possible within current power structures and governance systems.
And you can't achieve resilience by just focusing on one of those, like just building better infrastructure.
Exactly. GWT argues true resilience only emerges when you address all 4 simultaneously, recognizing they are constantly shaping each other. They're entangled.
The source gives a pretty stark example of this entanglement in action, or maybe it's disentanglement with the reported dismantling of USAID funding.
Yes, that case, based on reports from early 2025 regarding potential actions by the Trump administration, illustrates how a high-level political decision slashing USAID contracts and foreign aid budgets by a reported 90% or $60 billion,
Which is a huge political act.
becomes instantly entangled with material systems globally. Think about healthcare supply chains disrupted, water projects halted, food aid programs cut, and it also has massive symbolic consequences, signaling a shift in values, potentially damaging trust and relationships built over decades.
So one political lever pulls threads that unravel material realities and symbolic meaning worldwide almost instantaneously.
Precisely. It shows policy is never just policy. It's always entangled with matter, meaning, and power. Now, conversely, let's look at a regional experiment in intentional entanglement. The European Union.
Right. The EU is definitely a complex beast trying to weave different things together. How does GWT see it through the lens of entanglement?
The EU is seen as this vast living laboratory for entanglement. It actively tries to weave together the material and the symbolic to create integration.
Okay, give me an example of material and symbolic weaving.
Materially, look at something like the EU cohesion policy. It's allocating a massive $392 billion between 2021 and 2027, specifically to promote economic convergence and reduce disparities between regions. That's hard cash, concrete projects, physical infrastructure aimed at material equity.
Okay, that's the material side. What about the symbolic?
Symbolically, you have the constant reinforcement of shared narratives and identity markers, the EU flag, the anthem, Europe Day celebrations, the foundational story of post-war peace through economic integration. These symbols aren't just decorations, they actively work to structure a sense of shared purpose and belonging.
So the money, the cohesion policy, isn't just an economic program. It's a material manifestation of that symbolic goal of unity and shared destiny.
Exactly. The policies are consciously embedded within this larger narrative that aims to build integration and capture public imagination. Resilience in the EU context, then, is seen as relational. It emerges partly from efforts to repair historical harms, think post-Cold War integration, and this ongoing co-creation of inclusive futures, often driven by that cohesion policy trying to ensure the benefits of integration are shared more widely.
So the EU demonstrates that building a resilient region is about weaving a shared story where the physical infrastructure, the collective mindset, the political identity, and the pursuit of justice are all tangled up together.
Yes, you have to engage matter and meaning, systems and stories, technology and trust, all at the same time. That's entanglement in practice. Hashtag 2.3. Contextuality.
Which leads us nicely to the third dimension in this group, contextuality. This feels related to pluralism and relational knowing, but maybe more focused on place. It's the insistence that meaning, truth, solutions, they're all shaped by specific historical, cultural, ecological conditions.
Absolutely. Contextuality mandates the rejection of one-size-fits-all models. If entanglement says everything is woven together, contextuality says the pattern of that weave is unique to each specific place and time.
So the core principle is that resilience and sustainability are fundamentally place-based.
Utterly. Strategies have to be meticulously tailored. You see this working in practice, like the source mentions, in successful post-Cold War peace-building efforts in the Arctic, which relied heavily on indigenous self-governance models suited to that context. Or in Kristianstad, Sweden, where their renowned wetland restoration strategy was designed specifically around their local history of flooding and their cultural relationship with the landscape. Design must be embedded in the specific culture, ecology, and history of a place.
Okay, now the source brings up a very contemporary example. Google's approach to privacy and data governance, specifically around their Privacy Sandbox initiative. How is something as global and technical as internet privacy contextual?
It's a fascinating case of digital infrastructure being deeply entangled with context. Think about the Privacy Sandbox, Google's attempt to move away from third-party cookies for tracking users. Their journey, including the reported decision in 2025 to delay the full deprecation.
Which caused a lot of ripples.
Huge ripples. That whole trajectory isn't just a technical problem Google is solving in isolation. It reflects this complex interplay between the technical architecture itself, enormous market pressures from advertisers, and crucially, powerful regulatory forces that are geographically specific, like the EU's GDPR or California's CCPA.
So the global digital infrastructure has to adapt to local legal and cultural contexts regarding privacy.
Precisely. What's considered acceptable data use in one region isn't necessarily acceptable in another. So digital infrastructure turns out to be deeply contextual, and this implies that things like data privacy, digital accountability, even digital sovereignty, who controls the data generated in a place, become foundational for building equitable, adaptive, and contextually grounded sustainable development. It's a core resilience factor tied to local values and laws.
Even the internet isn't placeless. Okay, let's shift to a place utterly defined by its specific ecology and history, the coast of Somalia.
Yes, the 3,333 kilometers of Somali coastline offer an incredible illustration of deep contextuality. Any attempt at regionalization or development there has to grapple with these interwoven legacies. You have ancient Indian Ocean trade routes, a profound ecological embeddedness and health of coral reefs, mangroves mattering immensely, and centuries of cultural resilience, including rich Islamic scholarship and adaptation to maritime life.
So governance needs to be tailored to the logic of that specific coastline, not some generic global template for coastal management.
Exactly. Contextual specificity demands it. You can't just apply averages. You have to understand the distinct bioregional dynamics.
And the temporal context is crucial too, especially when looking at crises like piracy.
Absolutely revealing. How we understand and respond to current crises like piracy or drought or conflict is fundamentally shaped by which historical patterns we acknowledge. The narrative around Somali piracy, for instance, has shifted dramatically over time. Was it initially resistance by local fishermen against illegal foreign trawlers devastating their livelihoods, or was it always just organized crime?
The framing changes the response.
Completely. Ignoring the historical context, the legitimate grievances that might have fueled it initially, means you end up just addressing the symptom, the piracy itself, without tackling the root causes related to resource depletion, lack of governance, and external interference. Contextuality demands we look at the long historical arc.
Which reinforces the design insights from this dimension. Integrate local and indigenous knowledge, tailor everything from architecture to policy culturally, and really grapple with issues like digital sovereignty and local data governance as part of building place-based resilience.
Exactly. So we've explored the nature of reality, interdependence, pluralism, becoming, and how we know and connect with it. Relational knowing, entanglement, contextuality. Now we need to turn to the final set of dimensions, the ones that guide how we should act in this complex, dynamic, contextual world. Non-finality, ethical praxis, and transversality.
All right, non-finality. This sounds related to becoming the idea that things are always in flux. Non-finality seems to be the practical implication. No solution, no system, no plan can ever be considered complete, final, or closed off.
That's it precisely. It's the ontological realization, the understanding of the nature of being that leads to a practical mandate. Resilience isn't a destination you arrive at. It's an ongoing, evolving process.
So the core principle is embracing uncertainty, accepting that we can't predict or control everything.
Exactly. Uncertainty isn't a bug, it's a feature of complex systems. If the world is always becoming, always changing, then our approach to resilience has to be dynamic too. It has to be context dependent. Solutions need to be iterative, flexible, open to revision based on feedback. We have to avoid those rigid, static master plan blueprints that look great on paper but are guaranteed to become obsolete almost immediately.
The source uses the IMF Pakistan loan situation as a sort of negative case study here, an example of what happens when you ignore non-finality and rely on static solutions.
Yes, it's presented as a stark illustration. Pakistan's history, with reportedly 25 different IMF loan arrangements since 1958, and still owing billions, $8.3 billion as of May 2025, according to the source. This cycle is framed as a kind of entrapment.
A perpetual cycle of crisis and bailout.
Right. It highlights the failure of applying these standardized, universal IMF conditionalities, static solutions, to try and fix complex, deeply rooted structural issues within Pakistan's economy, all while global geopolitics are constantly shifting around it. The final fix offered by each loan program predictably fails to achieve lasting stability because the underlying system and its context keep changing.
So if that model failed because it lacked non-finality, what would a more non-final, flexible approach look like in that kind of situation, hypothetically?
Well, instead of demanding Pakistan hit very specific fixed economic targets, like a certain debt-to-GDP ratio by a certain date, regardless of external shocks, a non-final approach might focus more on building adaptive capacity, maybe linking funding to achieving broader social outcomes, strengthening local institutions, fostering economic diversification and self-reliance.
Building the ability to adapt rather than just hitting a number.
Exactly. And crucially, a non-final framework might build in pre-agreed mechanisms for adjustment. Imagine automatic triggers for debt relief or restructuring if the country gets hit by a major climate disaster, or a sudden global economic downturn events that are increasingly predictable in their unpredictability. These would be part of the agreement from the start, rather than treating each crisis as a shocking exception requiring a whole new, rigid negotiation. It would prioritize continuous learning and adaptation over achieving a fixed, final state of compliance.
That makes sense. Now, the Arctic Circle is presented as a case where non-finality isn't a choice, it's just the overwhelming reality due to scientific and geopolitical flux.
The Arctic practically screams non-finality. It resists any attempt at a fixed definition or a final plan. Why? First, massive scientific uncertainty. The phenomenon of Arctic amplification means the region is warming much faster than the global average, leading to rapid, unpredictable changes in ice cover, ecosystems, weather patterns.
The ground rules are literally melting away.
Literally. Second, you have ontological pluralism, the need to integrate the deep, long-term knowledge of indigenous communities who live there with cutting-edge climate science. And third, you have constantly shifting geopolitical interests colliding as new opportunities arise, new shipping routes opening up, access to previously ice-locked resources becoming feasible.
So how can you possibly govern a place that's physically transforming and politically contested so rapidly?
Yeah.
You can't rely on a fixed map or a static treaty.
You absolutely can't. Governance itself has to become fluid, adaptive. It needs to shift away from rigid top-down hierarchies towards more dialogical, iterative processes. The source points to the Arctic Council structure, specifically its inclusion of indigenous peoples' organizations as permanent participants alongside the nation-states, as a concrete example of embracing non-finality.
Giving a formal voice to those with deep, long-term adaptive knowledge.
Yes. It institutionalizes dialogue and co-learning as a core governance strategy. It accepts ambiguity. True resilience in the Arctic, GWT suggests, won't come from finding the one final technical solution to climate change, but from this ongoing process of collective reimagination, negotiation, and the open-ended design of shared futures in the face of radical uncertainty. Hashtag tag 3.2. Ethical praxis.
Okay, next dimension, ethical praxis. The praxis part suggests action, doing. So this is about ethics and practice.
Exactly. Ethical praxis asserts that the way we define problems, the way we frame solutions, especially around complex issues like sustainability and resilience, is itself a profound moral act. It's not neutral. Our choices about what to prioritize, whose voices to listen to, deeply shape the outcomes. Therefore, ethics, specifically justice, equity, responsibility, must be central from the very beginning of any design process.
So the core principle is that ethical design isn't just a nice-to-have feature. It's non-negotiable if you want genuine, lasting resilience.
Absolutely. It must actively prioritize things like equity, fair distribution of benefits and burdens, justice addressing historical wrongs and power imbalances, inclusivity ensuring marginalized voices are heard and empowered, environmental responsibility respecting ecological limits, and cultural sensitivity honoring different ways of life.
And it forces us to confront trade-offs.
Crucially, ethical praxis demands we consciously grapple with the often difficult trade-offs between, say, short-term economic needs and long-term ecological stability, or between present consumption and intergenerational justice, ensuring future generations have a viable planet. It calls for active moral engagement, not just technical calculation, to challenge structural injustice.
The community-level case study here is quite pointed. The reported deregulation efforts at the EPA, particularly policy shifts linked to the Trump administration, starting in early 2025. How does this illustrate a failure of ethical praxis according to the source?
Well, the source material frames these reported actions, the rollback of environmental protections, changes to federal energy and climate policies, as a clear example of prioritizing one value, short-term economic growth, above others.
Above intergenerational justice, ecological health.
Exactly. The analysis suggests this approach explicitly threatens intergenerational justice by potentially locking in long-term environmental damage. It potentially harms public health, often disproportionately affecting low-income communities or communities of color located near polluting industries. And, the source argues, it can undermine democratic accountability if these changes happen with reduced transparency or less opportunity for public input.
So it demonstrates that when you frame environmental issues solely through a narrow economic lens, ignoring the ethical dimensions of justice and responsibility, the result is likely to be more vulnerable and more inequitable communities.
That's the core argument presented. From a resilience design perspective, such deregulation, according to this analysis, weakens the capacity of local communities to prepare for and respond to disasters, like those linked to climate change. It hinders the collaborative, adaptive systems needed to navigate environmental challenges. Ethical praxis, in contrast, would demand robust participatory governance, policies centered on justice, and a fair sharing of both environmental benefits, like clean air, and environmental burdens.
Okay, let's look regionally. The Suzhou New District, SND, in China. It's often portrayed as a huge success story, an innovation hub. How does ethical praxis apply there?
S&D is indeed often framed globally as this model of innovation-driven regional development, a powerhouse. But ethical praxis, according to GWT, demands that we look beyond just the economic success narrative. It requires critical reflection on the internal contradictions and trade-offs.
Such as
issues around migrant labor who is benefiting from the growth and who is bearing the costs. What about the social displacement that often accompanies rapid development? What are the environmental trade-offs of that hyper-growth model? Ethical planning in a place like S&D would mean creating narratives, metrics, and governance processes that make these contradictions visible. It would ensure that regional planning isn't just optimizing for GDP, but is genuinely justice-oriented, considers intergenerational impacts, and is truly participatory, involving all segments of the community in shaping its future. Hashtag tag tag 3.3, transversality. And that brings us to our final dimension, transversality. This one is all about integration and collaboration, but in a specific way. It's the idea that the richest insights, the most effective and innovative solutions to complex problems emerge not from deep within single disciplines or silos, but at the intersections where different domains meet and interact.
Okay, so crossing boundaries. Not just multidisciplinary teams working near each other, but genuinely integrating knowledge across different fields.
Yes, and across different kinds of knowledge, too. The core principle is to foster fluidity, collaboration, and a sense of co-responsibility across all sorts of boundaries, between academic disciplines like ecology, law, economics, sociology, between scientific knowledge and indigenous or local knowledge, between theory and practice. Complex challenges, by their very nature, span these boundaries, so our responses must too.
We see the immediate consequence of failing to do this in the community case study about the discontinuation of a specific NOAA climate database.
Right, the source mentions the billion-dollar weather and climate disasters database.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
According to the report cited from May 2025, the termination of this database, attributed to shifting political priorities or perhaps budget and staffing issues, creates a significant data void. This isn't just losing a data set, it fragments our collective understanding of risk.
How does it hinder transversality specifically?
It directly limits the ability for transversal cooperation. Think about it. How can scientists studying climate trends, engineers designing infrastructure, economists calculating risk, insurance companies setting premiums, and policymakers planning adaptation strategies collaborate effectively if they don't have a shared, robust, publicly accessible baseline of data on the frequency and cost of these major disasters?
The common ground for conversation disappears.
Exactly. It hinders the ability to see connections, to integrate insights across sectors. The cost of that data void is potentially immense, compromising our collective ability to design resilient infrastructure, plan for future climate impacts, and make informed decisions both within the U.S. and globally, as others rely on that data too. Effective resilience requires that kind of robust, shared data infrastructure to enable transversal work.
Okay, so that's the negative example. What about a positive one? The Great Barrier Reef is presented as a place where transversality is essential, a living laboratory.
It really is. The Great Barrier Reef is facing existential threats, and its situation perfectly illustrates how ecological fragility is deeply interwoven with cultural identity, especially for traditional owners. Economic dependency, tourism is huge, and incredibly complex governance involving multiple levels of government, scientists, industry, and indigenous groups.
Survival demands bringing all those pieces together.
Absolutely. Resilience there, GWT suggests, emerges from what it calls braided interdependencies. This means actively weaving together different strands of knowledge and action.
What does that look like in practice on the reef?
Well, it looks like integrating cutting-edge biological interventions like research into coral IVF or developing heat-resistant strains with sophisticated economic modeling to understand and manage the impacts on the tourism industry. And, crucially, doing both of those in partnership with traditional owners, integrating their deep, long-term ecological knowledge and respecting their rights and cultural connection to their sea country.
So it's science, economics, and indigenous knowledge working together, not in isolation.
Exactly. Transversal logic requires these boundary-spanning methods. It requires adaptive management approaches where scientists, policymakers, tourism operators, and traditional owners are genuinely collaborating, sharing data, learning together, and adjusting strategies based on feedback. This fusion, cross-disciplinary, cross-cultural, cross-scale, is what fosters systemic adaptability in the face of immense challenges.
That really brings the 9 dimensions together. We've gone through interdependence, pluralism, becoming, relational knowing, entanglement, contextuality, non-finality, ethical praxis, and now transversality.
Yeah.
It feels like a comprehensive, if demanding, picture of reality. What's the big takeaway? What's a collective insight for someone listening wanting to apply this?
Well, if you weave all 9 dimensions together, the collective insight becomes pretty clear. GWT fundamentally reframes resilience. It's not some technical end state you achieve through clever engineering or optimized efficiency alone.
It's not a final destination.
No, it's an ongoing co-creative process. It's dynamic, sometimes messy. And it's deeply rooted in the quality of our relationships with each other, with other species, with place. It requires acknowledging interdependence, embracing pluralism by honoring diverse ways of knowing and being, accepting becoming and non-finality by designing for adaptation, grounding knowledge in relationships and context, understanding entanglement, acting ethically, and working transversely across boundaries.
So the conclusion is that this framework offers critical guidance for how we might actually design communities, regions, systems that can genuinely thrive, not just survive, amidst the complex, tangled-up crises of the 21st century.
That's the claim. But theory is one thing. The big challenge always is bridging that gap. How do we take this complex, nuanced theory and turn it into practical tools that people can actually use on the ground?
Right, the implementation challenge. The source introduces something called the layered tool ecosystem. Is this the bridge?
It's presented as exactly that. Importantly, it's not another rigid blueprint. It's conceived as a flexible, living architecture, a set of interacting layers designed specifically to facilitate that kind of relational design and adaptive transformation that GWT calls for.
5 layers, I believe, that interact with each other.
That's right, 5 layers, and the interaction is key. They continuously inform and shape each other.
Okay, let's break them down. Walk us through each layer. What's its practical function? Start with layer 1.
Layer 1, foundational layer. Think of this as the ethical compass, the value base for any project or initiative. Before you even talk about budgets or timelines, this layer establishes the core values, ethics, and principles drawn directly from those GWT dimensions we just discussed.
So practically, what does that look like?
Practically, it might mean a community development project starts not with an economic feasibility study, but with workshops to co-create a community charter that explicitly defines shared values around justice, ecological stewardship, intergenerational responsibility, and cultural respect. This charter then guides all subsequent decisions. It ensures the project is values-led from day one.
Okay, sets the ethical foundation. What's layer 2?
Layer 2, data and sensing layer. This is about how we perceive and understand the system. Crucially, it integrates 2 kinds of essential knowledge. First, yes, measurable quantitative data, water quality metrics, energy consumption figures, economic indicators, things we normally track.
The usual suspects.
Right. But second, and equally important, it integrates embodied insight. This is the qualitative stuff. Knowledge drawn from lived experience, from traditional ecological knowledge held by elders, observed changes in community well-being, stories about how the local ecosystem is changing.
So numbers and narratives.
Exactly. And the critical move here is integration, not hierarchy. Resisting the common tendency to privilege the hard quantitative data over the soft qualitative insights. GWT argues both reveal crucial patterns about the entangled reality. You need both to truly sense the system.
So instead of just measuring, say, traffic flow on a street, you'd also gather stories about how that traffic impacts neighborliness, children's ability to play, local businesses, a much richer picture.
Precisely. That leads to layer 3, design and engagement layer. This is the creative space, the engine for imagining and building futures. It uses highly participatory tools and processes, community mapping, storytelling workshops, scenario planning, citizen science projects, artistic co-creation, imagination-based exercises.
Getting people involved in designing their own future.
Yes, and framing design itself as inherently political, ethical, and hopeful. For example, you might use community mapping not just to identify assets, but to highlight historical injustices, say, areas redlined in the past. Then the design activities focus specifically on prototyping solutions that redress that legacy, ensuring the future actively embodies those shared values established in layer 1, rather than just optimizing for some abstract metric like efficiency.
It shifts planning from just reacting to problems towards proactively, imaginatively creating desired futures. Very different feel. What about layer 4? Where does power and structure come in?
That's layer 4, governance and ownership layer. This layer focuses on building the actual organizational, legal, and financial infrastructure needed to support community autonomy, system flexibility, and genuine equity. It's about embedding the values and designs into durable structures.
What kinds of structures are we talking about?
Practically, this could involve setting up community land trusts, CLTs, to ensure local control over land and housing. Implementing new digital governance tools that allow for more transparent and flexible community decision-making. Maybe using things like blockchain for managing shared resources fairly, or creating cooperative ownership models for local businesses or energy systems. The goal is to ensure power is shared, benefits are distributed equitably, and the systems can renew themselves from within, rather than being dependent on external, centralized control.
building the muscle for self-governance.
Okay.
And the final layer, layer 5.
Layer 5, integration and sharing layer. This recognizes that communities don't exist in isolation. Knowledge needs to travel, but GWT emphasizes it should travel as reciprocal wisdom, not as extractive data harvested for global analysis without benefiting the source.
So sharing, but respectfully.
Yes. This layer supports the creation of what the source calls a pluriversal commons networks, or platforms, where different communities can share their context-specific adaptive strategies, learn from each other's experiments, both successes and failures, but without being forced into a single, uniform model. It respects pluralism and contextuality even in the sharing process.
And the real power is how these layers talk to each other.
Absolutely. The ecosystem isn't linear, it's interactive. Local knowledge gathered in Layer 2 directly informs the participatory design processes in Layer 3. The prototypes developed in Layer 3 shape the governance and ownership structures built in Layer 4. And everything is constantly checked against the foundational ethical principles established in Layer 1. It's a continuous cycle of sensing, designing, governing, and learning, all grounded in values. Hashtag tag 4.3. The evolution of sustainability goals.
This GWT framework and maybe the tool ecosystem has also apparently led to the development of a new set of goals, the Sustainable Regionalization Goals, or SRGs. How do these relate to the existing frameworks we know, like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs?
Right. The SRGs are presented as emerging from applying GWT principles specifically to the challenge of regional development and resilience. They're intended to be complementary to, not replacements for, existing frameworks like human rights declarations or the SDGs.
So building on them, maybe critiquing them.
Exactly. Extending, critiquing, and enriching them. The key difference is that the SRGs shift the focus. While the SDGs often measure technical outputs, like rates of poverty reduction or access to clean water, the SRGs focus more on the underlying quality of governance, the strength of relationships, the ethical foundations, and a much broader understanding of value or capital. They try to get at the systemic conditions needed for resilience.
Okay, let's look at the examples given. They seem to directly reflect the GWT dimensions we've discussed.
Yeah.
Start with SRG-1.
SRG-1, just and relational governance. This goal flows directly from ethical praxis and relational knowing. Its aim isn't just good governance in the technocratic sense, but transforming governance itself into a living, co-creative, ethical practice. It emphasizes embedding governance in place-based values and fostering genuine intercultural dialogue.
How would that work practically?
It might involve things like institutionalizing legal pluralism, formally recognizing and creating ways for different legal systems like state law, indigenous law, local customary law to coexist and inform each other in policymaking. This builds legitimacy and cultural resilience because governance actually reflects the diverse reality on the ground.
Okay, that's a significant shift. What about SRG-4? It talks about multi-temporal governance. That sounds linked to becoming and non-finality.
Directly linked, SRG-4. Multi-temporal governance is a really radical challenge to conventional planning horizons. It pushes back against the tyranny of short-term thinking, quarterly reports, election cycles. It demands that governance actively engages with multiple timescales simultaneously.
Past, present, and future, all at once.
Yes. Honoring indigenous temporalities, which often have much longer perspectives. Incorporating cultural memory and lessons learned from the past. Explicitly acknowledging past injustices and their ongoing effects when planning for the future. And extending planning frameworks out much further thinking in terms of 50 or 100 years, considering intergenerational impacts.
So it turns regions into temporal commons, the source says, meaning we have a shared responsibility across time.
Precisely. A multi-temporal flood management plan, for instance, wouldn't just look at risk models for the next 10 years. It would incorporate oral histories about past floods, study the ecological changes in the watershed over the last century, and explicitly plan for deep uncertainty decades out, acknowledging our responsibility to future generations. It's managing across generations, not just fiscal quarters.
That's a profound shift in perspective. Okay, finally, SRG-16, holistic capital valuation. This sounds like it challenges our whole notion of value, linking back to interdependence and entanglement.
This one is perhaps the most conceptually revolutionary, SRG-16. Holistic capital valuation asserts that our current systems fail because they overwhelmingly value only one form of capital, economic or financial capital. GWT argues we need frameworks that recognize and account for 10 interdependent forms of capital that collectively create well-being and resilience.
10 capitals. Okay, list them, but maybe pause on the less obvious ones.
Sure. The 10 are Natural capital, ecosystems; cultural capital, heritage knowledge systems; social capital, trust, networks; political capital, governance capacity, legitimacy; economic capital, finance, assets; knowledge capital, innovation, education; symbolic capital, shared meaning, identity; technological capital, infrastructure, tools; and then two really interesting ones, emotional spiritual capital and temporal capital.
Okay, let's dig into those last two. Temporal capital, is that related to the multi-temporal governance goal?
Yes. Temporal capital refers to the collective memory, the historical consciousness, and the long-term planning capacity within a community or region. It's the institutional and cultural muscle memory that helps prevent repeating past mistakes and enables learning across generations. A community with strong temporal capital remembers how it adapted to the last major drought or economic downturn and applies those lessons. Low temporal capital means constantly reacting surprise to predictable cycles.
Got it. And emotional spiritual capital, that sounds very different from GDP.
Very different, but potentially just as crucial for resilience. Emotional spiritual capital encompasses things like the sense of belonging and place attachment people feel, the capacity for collective healing after trauma, the levels of social cohesion and mutual care, the presence of shared rituals or practices that provide meaning and connection. Think about it. If a region is suffering from high rates of loneliness, social isolation, or unresolved historical trauma, its emotional spiritual capital is depleted. That social fabric is fragile.
Meaning it might completely unravel when faced with an external shock, like an economic crisis or a natural disaster,
Yeah.
even if it looks okay on paper economically.
Exactly, because the capacity for collective action, mutual support, and psychological endurance isn't there. So this holistic valuation framework forces us to see the connections. Degrading natural capital might weaken cultural capital and emotional spiritual capital. But conversely, strengthening social and political capital, building trust, and effective local institutions might be the best way to regenerate natural capital over the long term. It confirms that GWT principle: everything is entangled. You can't optimize one capital by destroying another without eventually undermining the whole system. #tag outro.
This has been truly a deep dive. We've journeyed through the 9 dimensions of general world theory and explored some practical tools like the layered ecosystem and the SRGs. What's the core message you hope listeners take away from all this?
I think the core message, really, is a fundamental shift in perspective. Sustainable resilience isn't something achieved through top-down, uniform technical fixes. It's not about finding the single right answer and scaling it globally. Instead, it's built from the ground up. It emerges from embracing pluralism, valuing diverse knowledge and ways of being. It requires nurturing relationality, strengthening the connections between people and their place, and it demands an ongoing ethical commitment to adaptation, to learning, to becoming.
So it's about scaling up local wisdom, local narratives, local systems of care, not scaling down global uniformity.
Beautifully put. That's exactly it.
And the theory also strongly suggests that the legitimacy of our governance systems, our institutions, doesn't just come from having the right legal structure or procedures. It comes from something deeper.
Yes, it argues legitimacy also arises from moral grounding, from being perceived as just and ethical, and from genuine alignment with the complex, messy, lived realities of the people those systems are meant to serve. It really forces us to reconsider what success even means beyond simple metrics.
Okay, so considering all 9 dimensions we've explored today, that intricate web of interdependence, pluralism, becoming, relational knowing, entanglement, contextuality, non-finality, ethical praxis, and transversality, it definitely leaves us with a lot to think about. You have a final provocative thought for our listeners to mull over.
I do. If general world theory is right, if our systems become brittle and ultimately fail when they rely too heavily on singular worldviews and ignore this complex, plural, entangled reality, then here's the question for you to consider.
What is it?
Look around at your own city, your own community. Think about an existing system. Maybe it's related to housing policy or waste management or how your local schools operate or how the water supply is managed. Which of those systems feels the most vulnerable right now, precisely because it seems to be operating based on a single, dominant, perhaps expert-driven model, failing to integrate diverse knowledge, context, and values? Where is the lack of pluralism creating the biggest risk?